Christopher Columbus is famously credited with being the first European to reach the Americas in 1492, kicking off centuries of colonization and exploitation that had huge impacts across the world. But what if he'd never made it? What if, in fact, for some reason or another, Europeans just couldn't colonize the Americas? Well, let's find out. This is What If, and here's what would happen if Europe failed to colonize the Americas. Let's start by taking a closer look at Columbus' journey to the New World. While we now know that the Vikings had established a settlement in Newfoundland around 500 years before Columbus arrived, this is not the story of those guys. Instead, we're going to go with the commonly accepted timeline, starting with Columbus and the Europeans who followed him. But why did Columbus sail west? Well, his primary goal was to find a faster route to Asia, specifically India. The eastern land-based routes to Asia were long, dangerous, and expensive. So he and many others before him thought that a faster sea route must exist, and so they searched for it. Now, while Columbus never actually reached India, he didn't completely fail. He did, after all, reach the Americas, just not the ones that he was expecting, and he might have been one of the luckiest sailors in history. Had he sailed just a few weeks later or earlier, he may have run into the harsh waters of the Atlantic rather than the Caribbean. And speaking of luck, perhaps the biggest stroke of good fortune for the European powers and the Americas themselves was that the Spanish conquistadors who followed Columbus weren't looking for gold. In fact, when they first arrived, they barely even knew that they had reached new lands. It would be several more years before word spread back home in Spain that there was gold to be mined in these new territories. So instead, they tried to set up settlements only to find that their supplies quickly ran out. Their encounters with the native peoples were relatively peaceful at first, but once they realized that there was gold to be mined, things got violent pretty fast. Now, since we're changing history here, let's say that none of this goes according to plan. Maybe the seas are extra rough and Columbus' ships sink, or maybe he reaches land but is killed by natives who aren't like visitors. Perhaps disease runs rampant through his crew and wipes them all out. Whatever the case, the point is that nothing goes according to plan, and because of that, the Spanish crown doesn't get the message that gold can be found in the Americas. The next few decades are crucial. Portugal, Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands were all jockeying for position around the world. They sent explorers and colonizers out at their own peril, knowing that failure meant death or capture by rival nations. For our timeline to make sense, the Spanish needed to fail, or at least not discover any gold. So they continued to try for Asia. They established trading posts in Africa and attempt to round the southern tip of Africa. But the Dutch beat them to the punch and established their own colony there. Meanwhile, Portugal continues to push south down the coast of Africa, but they too are beaten to the most valuable trade routes by the Dutch. So now that we've established that Spain is going to be a major player in this alternate history, let's see what happens to the Americas. Over the next few decades, French, English, and Dutch explorers begin charting the coasts of North and South America. They establish a few short-lived trading posts, but without the promise of gold. None of the European powers really want to invest the resources necessary to maintain a colony. Even worse, the journey to the Americas was long and dangerous, and those who made it were often killed by diseases brought over from Europe, including smallpox, measles, and influenza. Since nobody wanted to risk their lives to colonize the Americas, the European powers largely leave the continents alone, allowing the natives to flourish. In fact, let's take a closer look at one of those native groups, the Aztecs. Imagine a world where Cortez and his men never reached Tenochtitlan. The Aztec Empire continues to grow in power and influence, eventually dominating central and southern Mexico. Now, it should be noted that the Aztecs weren't exactly a benevolent empire. They had conquered many of the other Mesoamerican tribes and often forced them into servitude. But compared to what would come with the Spanish conquest, their rule was almost ideal. Meanwhile, farther north, the Inca Empire is also expanding. In our timeline, Francisco Pizarro led a small band of conquistadors to the Inca capital of Cusco, where he captured and executed the Inca Emperor Otto. This marked the beginning of the end for the Inca, and soon their vast empire would be broken and their riches drained. But in this timeline, Pizarro and the Spanish never make it to South America. Instead, the Inca continued to grow in power until, in a few hundred years, they dominate the entire continent. So now we have two powerful native empires, the Aztecs and the Inca, flourishing in the Americas. With no outside interference, what did they do next? Well, since both empires peaked in the 1400s and 1500s, they would probably eventually fall due to internal strife or natural disasters. But had they survived, it's likely that they would have continued to grow in power. Eventually, they would have met up and clashed with each other. Who would win in a war between the Aztecs and the Inca? Honestly, it's hard to say. Both were impressive militarily with highly trained warriors. The Inca definitely had the advantage in numbers, but the Aztecs were more experienced in warfare. Ultimately, neither empire would survive for much longer. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Portuguese are starting to explore Asia from the east, finally establishing a route to India around the tip of Africa. They begin trading directly with the Chinese and Indians and skip over the middlemen, who had been buying and selling goods along the Silk Road. Because of this, European nations need to find a new way to acquire luxury goods like silk, porcelain, and spices. To make matters worse, the Ottoman Empire is growing and will eventually control many of the key trade routes between Europe and Asia. Europeans will continue to search for a faster route to Asia. So what if they succeed? Let's say that they find a way to navigate around or through the newly formed Ottoman Empire. What would they gain from it? Well, for starters, they would gain access to valuable resources and goods that they could sell back home for huge profits. But beyond that, they would gain an incredible amount of knowledge about the world. During the Age of Discovery, explorers were bringing back plants, animals, and ideas from all over the world. These introductions had huge impacts on the course of history. And the same would be true if Europeans found a faster route to Asia. However, this new information would also come with a cut. Just as Europeans were introducing pathogens to the Americas that devastated Native American populations, they would be exposed to new diseases from Asia and Africa, and many of these diseases would be devastating to Europeans. Let's take the bubonic plague, for example, also known as the Black Death. This horrible disease swept through Europe in the mid and killed an estimated 30 to 50% of the population. What if a similar plague came to Europe via the new trade routes? It would decimate the population and slow European expansion for decades. Or what if new diseases from Asia and Africa wiped out the Portuguese or Spanish ruling families? History could change in an instant. Ultimately, it's impossible to know exactly what would happen if Europeans had never colonized the Americas, but what we can say is that it would have changed the course of history in big and small ways. The Americas would likely be very different today, both politically and demographically. And Europe would be different, too. There is no telling what might have happened had the Spanish brought back the potato from the Americas, or if a deadly pathogen from Asia had made its way to Europe via the Silk Roads. What do you think would have happened if Europe had never colonized the Americas? Let us know your thoughts, and remember, if you enjoyed this video, to stay tuned for more thought-provoking historical tales.